Today we will look at what is commonly called the second missionary journey. Second missionary journey of Paul. There's a lot of material in this lesson, so I'll be merely highlighting in some instances. In order to work 28 chapters into the 13 lessons, the author of the class material left out a few chapters. Chapter 12 was left out and most of chapter 15 was left out. The author of this material chose to limit the focus to Paul's journeys, his trials, and his trip to Rome in the latter half of what we call half of the book of Acts. First part of chapter 15 tells of an important meeting that took place in Jerusalem with the apostles and elders. Last week we looked at chapters 13 and 14, which covered Paul and Barnabas' first journey. We noted that it probably took around 4 years, so it's understandable that they would have allowed some time to pass before they went on another journey. We don't know how much time was passed after the first journey until the second journey began, but referring to the time that passed, chapter 14 verse 28 says they stayed there a long time with the disciples. The there would be referring to Antioch once they made their journey, their first trip, and then came back to Antioch and stayed there, as it said, a long time with the disciples. So in chapter 15, verse 36, after the information about the meeting at Jerusalem, we read that Paul told Barnabas that he wanted to go back and revisit the brethren, the churches that had been established on the first journey. We're told that Barnabas wanted to take John Mark with them. He went with them on the first trip, but verse 38 says that Paul didn't want to take him. And the text indicates that it was because Mark had left prematurely on the first journey. We're not told why Mark left early. But Paul and Barnabas could not agree on this issue, so Barnabas took Mark and Paul took Silas. Barnabas took Mark and went to the island of Cyprus. Let me go ahead and switch maps here. I'll just stay with that one on second thought. Barnabas took Mark and went to Cyprus, and then Paul and Silas went through Syria and Cilicia and revisited the churches this way. We're told that Paul took Silas. I just mentioned that. Silas is a shortened form of the Latin name Silvanus. 3 times in Paul's letters and once in 1 Peter, Silvanus is mentioned. 2 Corinthians 1:19 says, "For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who was preached among you by us, by me, Silvanus, and Timothy." 1 and 2 Thessalonians chapter 1, verse 1. Both instances read Paul, Silvanus, and Timothy to the church of the Thessalonians. And Peter says in 1 Peter 5:12, "By Silvanus, our faithful brother, as I consider him, I have written to you briefly." We can't be certain that this is the same person, though it seems likely that it is. Each time that he's mentioned in Paul's letters, Timothy is also mentioned. But we have no more information in the Bible about Silas or Silvanus. Chapter 16, verses 1 through 5. We're introduced to Timothy in chapter 16 and verse 1. Let me go ahead and... I've got the right map up there. We're introduced to Timothy here in verse 1. We're told that when Paul came into Lystra and Derbe, which is here on the map, that he encountered Timothy. And verse 3 tells us that he circumcised Timothy. We're told that the Jews of that region knew that Timothy's father was Greek, so the possibility of him being uncircumcised would have been great. To prevent this from being a hindrance to Paul's efforts, he simply took care of the issue. And so after that, Timothy would be permitted to enter the synagogues and the houses of the Jews. Question is asked regarding this issue as it relates to Titus. Galatians chapter 2, verses 1 through 3 tell us that Paul refused to allow Titus to be circumcised, and that's because that action would have nullified the gospel in that the Jews were making a test case of it. Under the circumstances described in Galatians chapter 2, To allow Titus to have been circumcised would have been saying that one had to be circumcised to be saved. That's why Timothy was circumcised and Paul refused to do so to Titus. The decrees mentioned in verse 4 of chapter 16 are found in chapter 15, verse 22 through 29. This decree was written as a result of the meeting that took place in Jerusalem between the apostles and the elders of the church. As I mentioned a few moments ago, this class material skipped over that, but you can read about it in chapter 15, verses 1 through 29. Going on into chapter 16, verses 6 through 10, after visiting the churches established on the first journey, Paul wanted to go into Bithynia. Let me switch maps here. This is Asia Minor, which is this area here. And you see Bithynia up here. And you see on the map on their second journey, they traveled from Antioch and went to Troas. Bithynia is up in this area here. And so we're told that Paul wanted to go into Bithynia, but verse 7 tells us that the Spirit did not permit them to do so. We're not told why, but we do know that eventually the gospel was taken into Bithynia because Peter addresses Christians in that area in 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 1. He says, to the pilgrims of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. Perhaps the people of that area just were not ready at that moment to receive the gospel. This would not be the first time that God delayed doing something because the people of that area were not ready. Of any particular area were not ready. And because of the pronoun we, which is brought into the text in verse 10, it's commonly accepted that Luke, the author of the book of Acts, has now joined Paul, Silas, and Timothy on this journey. In chapter 17, verse 1, we'll see that Luke goes back to using the pronoun they. And he does that until chapter 20, where he again includes himself in the narrative. Chapter 16, verses 11 through 15. Verse 11 tells us that they sailed from Troas to Samothrace and then came to Neapolis. I should have, I guess you can see that okay. So Samothrace is an island here. Here's Neapolis. And then they go on to Philippi. And so from there they went to Philippi, which verse 12 describes as the foremost or the leading city of that part of Macedonia, which was a colony. And so Philippi was a Roman colony. A colony served as a military post for the defense of that area. The people in a colony were Roman citizens, and they enjoyed several privileges. They enjoyed freedom from scourging, freedom from arrest, except in extreme cases, and each person had the right to appeal to Caesar. Paul uses the first of those rights to his advantage in verse 37 of this chapter. When there was not a synagogue in an area, it was common for Jews to select a meeting place near a river or a body of water for their Sabbath worship. There was not a synagogue in Philippi, so Paul went to the location by a river where Jews met for worship. Only women were present here, the text tells us. This would explain the absence of a synagogue. 10 Jewish men were required in an area to have a synagogue. In verse 14, we're told that the Lord opened Lydia's heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. In various places in Scripture, we are told that the word pricks and cuts the hearts of people. I understand that Lydia's heart was opened by the Lord by hearing the word spoken by Paul. Verse 15 mentions that Lydia and her household were baptized. Those who believe in infant baptism assume that infants were a part of this household. This is one of 5 examples of what we call household baptisms found in the New Testament. None of them mention infants. The New Testament makes it clear that a person must be taught and must believe in order to be baptized. In this instance, the word household might have reference simply to Lydia's servants and others who might have been employed in her business. Chapter 16, verses 16 through 40, the rest of this chapter tells about an event that happened in Philippi. Paul and Silas were thrown in prison because they cast a spirit of divination out of a girl in the city who was being used to make money for her masters. While they were singing and praying in prison, an earthquake occurred and the prison doors were opened and all the prisoners' chains were loosed. Assuming the prisoners had escaped, the jailer was ready to take his own life because he would have been executed for the fact that the prisoners had escaped on his watch. Paul told this man not to harm himself, and the man asked what he must do to be saved. Paul taught the gospel to this man and to his household, and Paul baptized them into Christ. Chapter 17, verses 1 through 15, talk about the gospel being taken to Thessalonica and Berea. Using the map here, we're told that, it seems that Luke likely stayed in Philippi at this point because chapter 17, verse 1 goes back to the pronoun they, as I mentioned earlier. This being the case, Paul and Silas left Philippi and passed through Amphipolis, Apollonia, and then came to Thessalonica. They had some success in preaching the gospel there, but they were eventually forced to leave by Jewish opposition. So they left Thessalonica, and as you can see on the map, they just went on down to Berea. People here were very receptive to the gospel, but eventually the Jews from Thessalonica came to Berea, and Paul had to leave. And so we're told that he fled to Athens, which again is just further south. He actually took a ship and made his way down to Athens, which is here. Athens was a very idolatrous city. As we noted in chapter 14, when Paul went into the very idolatrous city of Lystra, his sermon was quite different than when he preached in a synagogue to Jews who believed in the one true God. Paul received a mixed reception in Athens, and contrary to the way he was treated in previous places, he left Athens on his own terms. In chapter 18, we have Paul leaving Athens and going to the city of Corinth. Here on the map, it's just across the isthmus here. There's Corinth. At Corinth, Paul encounters Aquila and Priscilla, who were apparently already Christians, and they were tent makers like Paul, and so Paul stayed with them. Because of its location, Corinth was one of the most important commercial centers of the world. It was a city of luxury and wealth, and it was full of wickedness. Paul experienced opposition from the Jews in Corinth like he had in so many other places, but verse 11 tells us that he continued there for a year and a half. Paul then began his journey back to Antioch. We're told that he traveled to Ephesus, then he went to the seaport city of Caesarea. I'm hopping and skipping some of the places here. He made his way south down to Caesarea. And then the text tells us that he went up and greeted the church, then went down to Antioch. The church he went and greeted was probably the church in Jerusalem. This map also indicates that view. Went to Caesarea, then goes down to Jerusalem, and then back up to Antioch. Verse 23 tells us that he spent some time in Antioch. Then he went on what is referred to as the third missionary journey. And so Paul begins his the third journey in chapter 18, verse 24, and it continues through chapter 21 and verse 16. And that's what we will look at next week, the third missionary journey of Paul.